Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this World Extreme Medicine podcast. My name is Dr. Jen Sherman, doctor, coach, and expedition medic. If you are a paramedic, a doctor, nurse, physio, or indeed anybody working in healthcare who has a curious and adventurous mind, then this is the podcast for you. Today we are going to be talking about exchanging medicine for mountains, and to explore this with me in this episode I have the pleasure of welcoming Anna Wells. Anna qualified as a doctor in the Scottish Highlands and is currently successfully made a career change to focus on climbing. She absolutely loves being in the mountains, the freedom of the wide open spaces and the rush of trying hard is where she is happiest. Her favourite activities are rock climbing, summer alpinism, skimo and running, and with her happiest moments including completing a winter traverse of the Cullin Ridge in one day, climbing El Capitan, summiting 37 4,000 hours in one summer, and having been fortunate to travel the world as part of the GB ice climbing team. Goodness, welcome Anna to the podcast. Delighted to have you with us. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure.
It's our pleasure. And where are you joining us from tonight?
I am up just north of Inverness in the Scottish Highlands at home.
Beautiful. I'm sure it's beautiful up there at this time of year. I think let's just dive in, Anna. I know our audience listening this evening would love to know just a little bit about your background. So just about where your first kind of love of the outdoors began.
So my love of the outdoors, I guess, kind of began indoors through climbing walls. So I got into climbing as a kid just at the local leisure centre and used to go indoor climbing once a week there, and that was where it all started really. And after I went to uni, which was actually first of all to do maths before I did medicine, I worked at a climbing wall in Aberdeen, and through that I got to know lots of people who were into outdoor climbing and just slowly picked up skills and learned as I went.
Brilliant. So, and at that stage, did you ever see yourself moving into that field as an actual career?
I knew it existed, but no, I'd never really seen myself doing that because I was always quite academic, and I always just sort of saw my pathway ahead as going to uni, getting a more conventional job. I do remember during studying for finals of medicine, looking through the criteria of the British guide scheme, because I was definitely thinking of alternate things at that time, but I don't think I ever really seriously thought about it until much more recently.
That's really interesting. So you initially went and studied maths, and kind of the climbing was very much a hobby for you at that point, and it stayed as a bit of a hobby. And then you went into medicine. Then you studied medicine. Is that right? Then after maths.
Yeah, I did. I went straight from maths into medicine. So it was 9 years in university, which people are often like, whoa, that's a lot. But actually, being in university is great. Like, you've got 3 months summer holidays, and yeah, it's such a fun, happy time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, 100%. So after you graduated then from medicine, what kind of direction have things taken for you?
So I was still really enthusiastic about medicine at that point, and I went to do a rural track programme for F1 and F2. So I was based up in Inverness and then over on the west coast in Fort William and Oban. And yeah, climbing was like a massive part of my life, but a very separate part of my life. And I kind of found, as I went through my junior doctor jobs, that I found the work very, very stressful, because I'm quite a perfectionist and overthinker and worrier. And I found it really difficult to go home at the end of the day and switch off. And I think I wanted to do everything to an impossible standard. And it just leaves you feeling deeply uncomfortable all the time when you can't do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think you're talking about something that, you know, I definitely can resonate with, and I'm sure there are others listening that can resonate with that really, really deep reflection, really. I think it's always hard when you have one of those reflections after studying something like medicine. So what did you do when you started to realise that, maybe it did feel uncomfortable for you and you weren't sure about your future in it? I mean, how was that as a time of your life, and how did you manage that?
I guess it was definitely a confusing time, but I was determined to make it to the end of FY2. There was a point during F1 where I was quite close to leaving. I kind of sat down with my program supervisors and we had a big discussion, but I decided to stick it out till the end of F2. And then I guess it was quite a natural career break. Certainly where I was studying up in the Highlands, there were a lot of people who were taking time out and going over to New Zealand and Australia. Maybe it's less academically driven, the people who tend to go in those remote placements, but it certainly didn't feel like strange or scary with the idea that I might take a bit of time out. So I signed up to a locum agency and then packed my car and ran away to Chamonix in the French Alps. And I think during that time it was quite nice and reassuring getting, regular texts from the locum agency saying, oh, there's a shift in this hospital, and you always knew it was there to go back to. It was always sitting right there if you wanted it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's one of the real positives of it, isn't it? As a career, is that is that, isn't it? So, so you took yourself off to Chamonix, and you got lots of texts from local agencies, but I'm imagining you weren't local in Chamonix. so tell us about what did that time in Chamonix involve?
Loads and loads of just rock climbing, alpine climbing. And then I ended up staying into the winter and did lots of skiing and ski mountaineering. And yeah, I guess that winter was probably a bit of a turning point for me, because like my savings were starting to run out a bit. So I took up some jobs like doing some transfer driving and babysitting. And yeah, at first it was definitely confusing because you're kind of wrapped up in the identity of, being a doctor. You looked nicely upon by society. And you really start to question yourself then when you're doing a different job, like you're driving a transfer bus and babysitting. And actually, when I kind of thought about it, I was in every way so much happier doing these stress-free jobs and having so much time to have fun and be with friends. I think what made it easier as well being in Chamonix is there's definitely a bit of a lifestyle thing with it. So I knew quite a lot of people who'd come from good careers in the UK. They'd been investment bankers or engineers and teachers, and they were all out in Chamonix driving minibuses as well. And it was definitely quite comforting. You're like, oh, well, if they can make this lifestyle change, then so can I.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something really powerful in what you've just said, and that's it's the power of community. When you're trying to make some form of a transition, it's so much. It can be so much more readily nurtured when you're surrounded by similar or like-minded people. Does that make sense? Definitely, I think it can be much harder if you're trying to do that, but you're still surrounded by a different type or people who've stayed within something. It takes much more courage, I think. Not that it doesn't already take courage to have done exactly. It takes a lot of courage, but do you know where I'm coming from?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Yeah. So you were in Chamonix having a great time, and this was the time then that you started to think, actually, maybe I am going to allow myself to do something different. Is that how things went, or was there more to it?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I remember saying to myself when I went out to Chamonix, I was like, give yourself a year to just have fun and don't get stressed about your future and what you're going to do next. Just enjoy it. But probably most driven people who end up doing medicine in the first place, my brain was definitely ticking away thinking, yeah, but what am I going to do? And so at some point I decided that I would work through all of my outdoor and mountaineering qualifications. I remember almost feeling like a bit of an epiphany. I was like, because I'd met a lot of people in medicine who hadn't been happy, but had tried to leave and then hadn't really had anything else to go to, or they hadn't found another direction. And I think at one point I thought, I'm really lucky. There's this whole other world and career that I've got so much passion for. Maybe I could give this a go.
Yeah, definitely. It was like you knew what you were jumping to from, if that makes sense. I think and I think it's again a really important point, is I think that we all, when we're making a big change in whatever way, but particularly I think professionally, like I think having like clarity of purpose is so important. You have to have some form of clarity as to what you're going to, because I think if it's not there, it's really hard to it's really hard to know what actions you need to take. Does you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely. So over about 2 years, I went back and forth between Chamonix and the UK, finishing up qualification. Also having a shoulder operation with quite a long recovery, which was a big memory in that.
Yeah. So over that time, then you got all your professional outdoor qualifications, and because this is a question I think people often ask as well, and did you support yourself through those? So did you self-fund all of those?
Yes, I did. Yeah. And some of them were quite expensive. Frustratingly, I invested a huge amount of time and money doing my international mountain leader qualification, which I then lost my first season of work to with COVID, and thereafter it's become, I think, almost impossible with Brexit. So that was potentially a lot of time and effort. But I had so much fun along the way and learned a lot, met awesome people.
Yeah,
I guess you can never look back and regret things.
Yeah, no, definitely. So does that, so after getting kind of all the outdoor qualifications, then what did you what direction have you taken things since?
So I set up a company called Rocks and Trails, and through that my two kind of favourite things to do are guiding people in the mountains. So I've done a lot of work guiding people in the Cullins on Skye, there's 11 Munros on the Cullin Ridge, which are quite serious compared to all the other Munros. So a lot of hill walkers like to be guided on those. So I've done a lot of guiding on Skye. And I also love teaching people rock climbing. So equipping people with the skills so that they can go outdoors independently in the future and climb themselves.
Yeah. And how have you found that, kind of making that transition? Because I guess essentially now you have your own business. I mean, how do you find that?
I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, I quite like being able to organise my time myself. It's very different to NHS rotas, I guess, where you don't have much say over what's happening. And yeah, I really enjoyed there's not many women, like female mountaineering instructors, so it's been amazing. I think I've kind of attracted a bit of a niche market, like a lot of ladies. I've had lots and lots of ladies out in the mountains who, like, maybe otherwise wouldn't have gone. And I think that's a really nice place to be able to fill and take people.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I guess, why do you think that is? Do you think there's something about women feeling more comfortable with a female instructor, or do you think, I
think so. I think from speaking to women, I think it's a whole variety of things, but I think part of it is like the very old school idea of an instructor who's just gonna like head down, march people up the mountains and like be rushing you. But that's obviously totally not the case. Like, all my male instructor friends are absolutely wonderful, but I think women just sometimes feel more confident with another woman, and they maybe imagine you're going to be more patient and understanding.
No, definitely. Definitely. And so, obviously, at the beginning of the podcast, I within the bio, I listed some amazing accolades that you've obviously accrued in your time, as an outdoor professional. So, I wonder if you would mind just talking us through some of those, like, how they came about and some of the highs and lows of those experiences.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question.
I mean, if it
So I
helps,
guess,
choose one. If it helps, choose the one that means the most to you. That's sometimes that might be a better way of thinking about it. Which of your achievements feels like it means the most.
I guess, like the summers I spent in the Alps doing lots of big alpine 4000ers have been really magical. Back in 2013, when my friend and I, we tried to go and climb. Well, originally we actually tried to go and climb all 82 of them, which was, in retrospect, somewhat ambitious. But we ended up doing 37, and well, I kind of like the vibe behind that as well. In that, yes, it might have been crazy to try and do all of them, but if we hadn't set such a ridiculously big target, then we probably wouldn't have done anywhere near 37. So yeah, I love being in the Alps in summer. I'm not very good with the cold, so I love days in the mountains where you're moving quickly. So it's not lots of really hard technical bits where you're pitching it on ropes and standing around holding the ropes for each other and like moving overall quite slowly. I love days when you're on big long ridges that are difficult enough that your brain is occupied by what you're doing, but easy enough that you can progress quite quickly. That's probably my favourite thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think, I know some of our listeners will also be kind of thinking, even about their own, maybe wanting to step out and do their own adventures, maybe obviously not to the quite to the same level of some of the amazing things that you've obviously set out and, beautifully achieved. But, I guess, what would you say for yourself is how do you manage your mindset when you're setting out to kind of, like that summer in the Alps, you're setting out, you've kind of created this big challenge for yourself. I mean, how do you manage your own kind of mindset during that? And, what do you think is key to your resilience whilst you're kind of doing those kind of big challenges?
I guess taking each day at a time. So trying not to think about the whole challenge as a whole, but just what you're doing tomorrow, what you need to organise right now for the next steps. And also just having like good positive people around you as well, I think makes a massive difference. People you can trust and rely on and get on well with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So it's kind of like, it's really interesting because it's often echoed in I think many others who've, like you, went out and maybe done, big ultramarathon challenges, but it's a very, very common theme. People talking about taking things in very bite-sized chunks as a way to kind of manage the overwhelm of what the challenge might feel like at times, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, because I remember when I'd always really wanted to go to Yosemite, which is a big rock climbing area in America. And I remember that seeming like massively overwhelming because there were so many new skills that I didn't really have yet. So there's a lot more rope path involved, and you've got to, when you're climbing big walls and sleeping on the wall and hauling up your gear and stuff. And I remember the first thing I did was bought a guidebook for Yosemite, like the climbing guidebook. And then the second thing I did was booked flights to San Francisco. And then once you've kind of made that commitment, you know that you're gonna get there. You're gonna take all the steps you need to do to get there. But I think, yeah, doing something quite committing and then something that's going to be your first of many baby steps is a good start.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, at the moment, do you have any other big challenges in the pipeline?
I have some ideas for the winter. I think I'll stay in Scotland this winter because I kind of like certainty. I don't like the idea of making plans that then may or may not get to happen with whatever happens in the world over the next few months. So I've got some ideas for link ups of routes that I'd quite like to do in Scotland in winter. Because as I said before, I've always preferred the endurance side of it. So big long days where you're challenging yourself on that rather than like scary, harder stuff where you get really cold.
Yeah, that's your niche. That's where you kind of feel like you come alive more, or you're in the zone, or yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
And you've mentioned obviously that within your guiding work, and also personally as well, like the Cullins in Skye it sounds like they hold a special place in your heart. I mean, what is it about that mountain range? I mean, what is it about Skye that kind of draws you to there?
It's just so beautiful. Like the quality of the climbing and scrambling, like all around on the ridge, is just amazing. And you can look around you at any point and just see so many different rock faces, and you know that there's climbing everywhere. And then it's the fact as well, you look down and you see the sea all around you as well, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm on an island. And yeah, it just feels very, very special. It feels so different to anywhere else in Scotland, yet it's so close. It's like it's right there.
Yeah. And obviously that's one of your big achievements as well, is completing a winter traverse of the Cullin in one day. Is that right?
Yeah, we did it in one day. A very long day. It was 21 hours long, but it was a day.
Wow. And again, how was that? What were the highlights and lowlights of that?
I think probably one of the highlights was just knowing it was going to happen, and that the forecast had come together, because it's so rare that the Cullin Ridge comes into condition for a winter traverse, because it's an island, it's and actually not that high. Like all the peaks are less than 1,000 meters, so compared to like the Cairngorms or Ben Nevis, a lot of places where people do winter and ice climbing, they're actually quite low. And then I think the sort of sea air, the island climate, makes it different as well. So yeah, you just need so many things to come together for it all to work in the first place, like having free time, having a partner, and having good conditions. And yeah, it was just an absolutely epic day. One of the best days ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anybody who looks at your name online, there's some wonderful pieces that you've written and been involved with. But I mean, one of the questions I would love to ask you is what what adventure gives to your life? I mean, what I know it's a huge question, but it's motivated you to make a big career transition, to start your own business, to there's obviously something that you're so passionate about. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you can kind of put your fingers on what adventure means to you, or why why it lights you up.
It's such a hard question, but I can even remember when I was back in high school, all my early years of climbing were really just indoor focused. But I think I always had some sense or idea that I wanted to be out there in the sunshine doing really fun things. Because I can remember walking home from school on really sunny days and feeling like I was missing out in some way. I know that sounds really tragic, but just oh, why am I here in this town and the sun shining? And I guess there's I grew up in Inverness, so I guess there's pretty good views. You can kind of see the hills a bit. But I used to do a lot of things I'd go on really long bike rides when I was a kid, and I just really loved being out and having a little mission, whatever that was. And in high school I did the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, and that was probably among the first times that I went camping and doing a big hike. And I remember really enjoying that process of sitting down and planning out your route, and then actually living out that trip that you'd just planned, and doing it with friends as well. Because I think my most memorable mountain days or climbing days have always been about the company and the people I was with, rather than whatever the objective was. I think that's definitely what makes days special.
That's really interesting. I think it's that connection thing, the social connection, the connection to the surroundings, but something around connection, isn't it, that it makes it so special.
Definitely, because I think on any day when you go out climbing or walking, you go through so many intense emotions, and I think that's quite a bonding thing. So, in the morning you've probably got excitement, some nervousness because you don't know how it's all going to go, and then depending on what you're doing, there's probably some fear, uncertainty, and then that joy and jubilation, and they're just such intense emotions. You feel really close together, And I think sharing that with someone is, it's amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that kind of cycle of emotions and going through that with others. I mean, I guess another probably quite difficult question to answer, but I mean, what do you feel like you learn from that? What is it about going through that all the time that you learn about do you learn things specific about yourself or about others or about the environment?
I guess it could, I guess like, that it's going to change, like that all these feelings are transient. So when you're, I don't know, worried or stressed, you just you can have faith that no, it's going to change, it's going to get better. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, isn't it, in terms of how taking those types of insights and the lessons gained through those types of experiences, and then just being able to, how that influences life, if that makes sense. I know that sounds like a very philosophical thing to say, but then how that gives you confidence in other stresses and strains of life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I remember it's something, I'm not sure how much I believe in transferable skills in all their senses, because I remember when I was finding work stressful at the hospital, so many people would say to me oh, how can you be so comfortable hanging off a cliff face, but then you're so worried and stressed about every tiny thing in medicine. And I think a lot of it is that in climbing and mountaineering, you are doing everything you can to mitigate the risks, and you have quite a lot of control over a lot of those risks, whereas in medicine, I think a lot of the risks feel more invisible and outside of your control. And I think I'm a very kind of calm, confident person in the mountains, but I never really felt that way in medicine. And I think that's quite interesting, that these sort of terms, it's not like someone is a confident person or they're not. You can be very confident in one situation and not in another.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is such a I think that's such a, it's a bit of a, I mean, to the listeners, what I would say is, if there's, that's our bit of wisdom from this podcast. There's a lot of wisdom in this podcast, but I think that is so important. I think you've highlighted something really, really important, actually. Really important. And, I think, I hope actually, I hope that I'm sure you've helped a few people actually by just saying that. So without realizing it. But I think, I guess what I would say is, what I find really interesting is, how do you interpret that now? Do you, that kind of knowing that actually when I'm outside, when I'm, taking people out on the Cullins, when I'm out in my own adventure, I am calm and I'm confident. But when I was in that environment, that wasn't me. It wasn't that version of me. How, with time and some distance away from, from medicine, really, I guess, how would you interpret that now? What would you give meaning to? How would you give meaning to that?
So I still think I would be just as stressed and worried if you put me back in a medical situation. I think what I have reflected is that it's really, really hard to actually know yourself and your strengths and weaknesses and how you react in different situations. And I now try and think a lot more about, but how will I actually feel if I go to try and do that thing? So for example, this winter, I'm thinking of doing some math tutoring, and I'm and getting a lot better at, rather than just thinking up an idea that sounds good, actually thinking, how will I react in these situations before kind of jumping headlong into something? But it's obviously super hard, and in school when you're 17 and you're choosing your career, there's no way you'd ever really be thinking about all these things. You don't realize how important they are, and these really subtle character traits. And also, I think something I've thought about is that things that can be a disadvantage in one area can be a big strength in another. And that was something I thought about in medicine, because I'm my brain is hyper analytical, and I see all the tiny little details and things that made it very difficult in medicine. But something I've got into, like the last couple of winters, I've taught myself like computer programming, and I'm quite interested in maybe like getting into data science or something. And actually all those things that kind of held me back in medicine would be like a really good asset in that. So if you've got like, you could have like 100 pages of computer coding, and if you've got one comma out of place, then the whole thing doesn't work. And like, I like that fact. Like, that's how my brain works. It's like, yes, everything needs to be perfect. So I think I realized at some point, rather than struggling against all these natural personality traits, maybe actually if you're doing something different, these things become strengths.
Yeah, I mean, so much wisdom in that also, I think, Anna, because I think there is, honestly. I mean, I think that one thing that, and I'm not sure whether you experienced this, I wouldn't want to speak for you. It would be really interesting to hear what you think about this. But one thing I think happens quite a lot in medicine, actually, is people who are maybe in the situation that you described begin to think that there's something wrong with them. So instead of it actually being that it's just the person environment fit isn't right, because ultimately that is what the bottom line, that's what we were talking about, is the person and the environment aren't fitting. It's not a good fit. Instead of that being the ultimate kind of frame of looking through it, instead of that being the frame, which is a really positive frame actually, there can sometimes be more of a sense of it's something wrong with me. There's something lacking in me. The limitation was in with me and my inability to match the demands of the situation. And I think that way of thinking can actually occur quite commonly. And I think that not the problem, but the challenge with that, whenever it does happen, is that the impact that has on your well-being is profound. It starts to, it can, it can be really challenging, and I think it can, lead people into some really, really difficult places. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And it's because especially going through F1 and F2, you have quite a big peer group, and I definitely would be looking around thinking, oh, like everyone else is coping so much better than me. Like, why am I the only one who's having to run away and cry in the toilets like 3 times a day? And also, I think, like, I loved so many parts of the job. Like, I absolutely loved like interacting with patients, or like doing the things where I felt like I knew exactly what I was doing. Then I absolutely loved it, and I loved the sort of teamwork side of it. And so it's very easy to think all these other bits are brilliant, so I just need to sort out this one little thing, like my confidence, and then everything will be fine. And sort of combined with the fact of how much, time and effort you have already put in at that point, like doing your medical degree, and you just feel so invested. And yeah, you definitely end up feeling like you're the problem and you just need to fix this one thing that you can't quite get right. Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, obviously this isn't a podcast about me, but I think one thing I would just throw out there to anybody who's listening to this podcast who might find themselves in the situation that we are talking about is that the, biggest gift that you can give to yourself, and I mean, Anna, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, is to step back, and is to, we all have, we all deserve to have work that we enjoy and that we find meaningful, and that, there'll be some stress associated with it, and it's good stress rather than all being bad stress, because there's a difference. I really firmly believe, and that's what the research says as well. So I guess, just my message to anybody who's listening to this is, reach out, speak to somebody. And I don't know, Anna, do you have anything?
And I found,
I was just saying, I just feel like we've naturally,
like when I spoke up about, oh, sorry.
No, of course, I was just saying, I feel like we've naturally touched upon this in the podcast. So yeah, go on ahead, sorry, yeah.
I definitely found that speaking up was really helpful, because as after I'd sat down with like supervisors and colleagues and really talked about like how I felt that everyone was really, really supportive and helpful, and it made my experience of the rest of F1 and F2, I think, a lot better than it would have otherwise. Because I think we're like, we spend half of our training getting really good at looking calm whilst we're struggling on the inside. And I think because we get so good at that, it's like actually your colleagues and the people around you might not realise how you're actually feeling. And I found only positive things came out of properly sitting down and talking to people about how I was finding it all. So yeah, I definitely recommend being as open and honest as you can to people.
Yeah.
And I think the thing you said as well about taking time away is a really good measure, because I met quite a lot of people who had found it hard taking time out, but then actually gone back to it, and I like, whether that's after having kids and like your mindset maybe changes a little bit about risk and perspective on that. I think, taking time out and talking to lots of people is really helpful.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, 100%. And I think, I think you've just made another really important point, which is that just because you transition to do something else, it's not a one-way street. I really believe that nothing's ever a one-way street. Just because you decide to go one way, it doesn't mean you can go back. You can't go back that way another time. You just like, what I mean? I think it's also, it's also acknowledging that actually, nothing's permanent. No decision is permanent, because I think sometimes when we put the weight of the world on ourselves, when we think that we're making a decision that we can never ever go back on, it feels too much. Whereas if we change the language and say, actually, I'm gonna go and take some time out and try a few new things. I'm gonna relax and get to know myself. I'm gonna go and have some fun. Like all of these things that, like, a life worth living's worth having those things, isn't it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, because we said, before we started recording the podcast, we were just chatting there, I think I was saying, like, when I first went to Chamonix, at that point, the idea of giving up my medical license would have seemed utterly terrifying. But 3 years later, when I was pretty settled in my new career and sort of my new identity, I guess, and place in the world, it actually didn't even feel like a thing at all when I finally clicked all the buttons to give up my license to practice. And I think that was definitely a big part of it, knowing it was always there if I wanted to go back. Yeah,
definitely. No, definitely. And I think that's the thing about it's about transitions, isn't it? Is that they're not overnight things. They take time. They take years sometimes as well, don't they? Really, it's not. Change is rarely. It's rarely a quick thing, and it shouldn't be. If that makes sense. In some ways, if you're doing it properly, it takes time, doesn't it? Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, I guess, thinking about the future, and I think about how you would like, your business to grow, or where you see yourself kind of going, can you share a few thoughts with us about that? Do you have any kind of exciting plans or ideas or ways you'd like to do things in the future?
I guess I'm really enjoying the balance I found at the moment. The kind of mountaineering season is sort of about 2/3 of the year, like spring until autumn, and then having a quieter time climbing over the winter. I guess I've always kind of liked the idea of doing something good and meaningful. And, I'd love to be able to offer climbing and scrambling to, people who couldn't afford it, like run free sessions and stuff, because I think it's so good for like mental health and well-being. Like a lot of that's come out of lockdown over the last couple of years. Like so many more people have got into the outdoors, and I think everyone's really realizing the benefit of pushing yourself physically or being out in beautiful places. And I'd love to be able to help lots of people find that.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think there's such a need for it, isn't there, now more than ever? I think, and I think particularly amongst young people, I think they're one population group that they've they've almost lost a lot of their youth through the pandemic, haven't they, with not being able to do all the normal things that you do when you're at university, or you're young and you maybe go traveling. These things haven't been available to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it must have been so hard for people in school, university, everywhere in between.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, unfortunately, it's always a sign of a good conversation, but we are actually getting near the end of our time, and I can't quite believe it. That one went very quickly. But I'm just wondering, Anna, I'm sure there'll be a few people who've listened to the podcast and would like to connect with you. So I'm just wondering, what's the best way to connect with you? Is it through social media, or just in case anybody's interested?
Yes, social media. My Instagram is @rocksandtrails, or my email address. Can I give out my email address on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're happy to, I mean, like, if you're happy to, if it's on your website and you're happy to give it out,
Yeah. So my email address is annawells111@gmail.com. And it would be, if anyone fancies getting in touch, I'd be more than happy to chat through anything to do with medicine or transitioning or climbing. So please get.
Oh, I think that's quite the offer. I think you might have a busy inbox. And I wonder, I mean, I always like to wrap these podcasts up at the end with, I mean, there's been so many great golden nuggets through this chat that we've had this evening, but I guess what would be your words of wisdom with everything that you've kind of done over the last couple of years? If you could just leave myself and the listeners with, a couple of words of wisdom, I mean, what would they be?
You should have prepped me for a question like that. I think just to, I know this sounds really cheesy, but to be true to yourself. So figure out what your strengths are and do things that make you feel happy and confident and good about yourself and what you're doing. And just try and have fun.
Yeah. No, I think that's brilliant. I think that's brilliant advice. And I think, I think being true to yourself is such an important thing. And I guess just one question around that, because sometimes I've said this before, and sometimes people then, the question back is, how do you know you're being true to yourself? So I guess it's just one thing I would just love to ask you. So doing what you're doing now compared to what it was like when you were a junior doctor in the wards, how do you know that now you're being true to yourself compared to what you were doing then?
I think this is something I sometimes ask myself is, if you won the lottery tomorrow, how much about your life would you change? And if you actually wouldn't end up changing a huge amount about your life, then I think that's quite a good sign that you're being true to yourself.
I think that's brilliant. Yeah, definitely. No, I absolutely love that. Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Yeah, sorry that you didn't mind me.
No, thank you for having me.
Question when we're trying to wrap up the session. I just felt it was a really important thing, because to kind of just flesh out a little bit. But I mean, thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm happy for such an inspiring conversation.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's great. And thank you so much to our listeners. And I mean, hopefully this will go out in time, but I just want to also just flag up, I'm sure many of our listeners are already aware of the Extreme Medicine Conference. But if you're not, head over to the WEM website, or you can head to extrememedicineexpo.com. There's a whole section there about registration. Some days are sold out. The virtual conference is not sold out. So if you're not aware of it, I would really encourage you to go and check it out. There's an amazing lineup this year. And it's fantastic that we're able to run the in-person expo this year too. So thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and looking forward to seeing you next time.